So this month's Lunch and Learn is really geared around how you might adapt TED or support teams who might have technological barriers. So I've called it TED for low tech teams for want of a sort of a better description. But really, I think this is a bit of a blanket term which could describe a lot of different teams who, in some way, shape, or form, have a barrier related to technology. So today's session really is geared around different ways that you can support those sort of teams. You can encourage them to get involved in TED. But really, and I guess this is what TED's all about, is trying to embed that continuous improvement practice. So in low tech teams, I think a big part of this is helping those sorts of teams recognize that although technology is part of TED, it's an important part in keeping that anonymous feedback loop, creating that safe space. It's really a very small part of it. So if there is a technological barrier, there are lots more parts of the TED process which are more important to get right if you have to work around the technology barrier in some way. So the objectives for today are to identify different types of teams who might experience technological barriers. Feel free to share your own experiences, maybe some of the teams you've worked with or teams that you see maybe have some challenges related to using TED and the technology involved in it. We'll look at some of the approaches that you can use to support them and some of the things I've used in the past with teams who don't use technology as part of their everyday practice. And we'll also look at options to embed continuous improvement practice, because really that's what it's all about. And the technology is just there really to help facilitate that. And if we can do that in other ways, then that's just as good for the teams, the team culture and the team engagement that we're looking to work on and improve through TED work. So I guess the first question is, what do we mean by a low tech team? So when I think about this topic, I'm thinking about teams who I've worked with that might have some sort of barrier to using technology. I've put some examples up there on the slide. So they might be things like estates, function teams, people like maybe joiners, engineers. It might be portering teams who, although they might use a computer as part of some of the role, the majority of their role doesn't involve being in front of a computer, using their email regularly, things like that. Sometimes facilities teams as well, so staff groups such as domestic services, cleaners, caterers, those sorts of teams often may not engage with their staff email addresses. They might not use computers very often. They might not need to at all in their role. But it's not to say it's just non-clinical teams. Sometimes clinical teams might also have technological barriers in their work area. Sometimes it might be, I've come across this with HCA teams. So I've had occasions where a department's wanted to run a TED for a group of HCAs, and as part of their role, they just don't engage with the technology, or they don't need to as part of their role. So we've had to think outside the box a bit to how we make it accessible to those groups. And sometimes it can be other support teams as well. So even teams who you might expect to use computers might not always be totally comfortable with it, especially when you introduce something like TED on top of quite a lot of other computer systems that teams might use. I'm thinking in our trust we'll have patient record systems. Different departments might have systems specific to the type of service they provide, and then on top of that we've got our trust intranet, we've got the server function, and not everybody is sort of geared to adopt these types of things quickly. And the idea of adding in another type of technology, another web service to use on top of what they already use and have to learn, can be quite daunting for some teams. And thinking about my experience in the past, I've had examples where teams like physio teams, maybe phlebotomists, I know some of our trusts are ambulance trusts, so those types of workers in ambulance teams might not necessarily be desk-based very often. Also teams that work out in the community as well, who are quite dispersed, sometimes might not use technology very much. I'm thinking about maybe community midwife teams and teams like that who may have very different working practices. So today's session really is around thinking around with these types of teams, how can we support them, or how can we flex the TED approach to help them work on team engagement in a way that suits them. So I guess what we're saying when I mention all these different examples, we're thinking about teams who might have technological barriers for a range of different reasons. So some of those teams may not have access to the type of equipment they need to use the internet to be able to either set up a TED, or from a team member's perspective, get the email, click on the link, fill out the survey in that way. Often the nature of some teams' work doesn't require them to have a computer in the role, or there might be other teams who might use computers occasionally, but maybe they don't have a suitable environment to allow them to complete the TED survey. So they might not have a private space for them to be able to read and interpret the survey and fill it in that private space. Maybe it might be a team who's no access to a printer or a screen where they can share the results, and it might be more around that facilitated part of the TED cycle where they might struggle, or it might prove a barrier. So often also, even when teams do have access to equipment, there can be challenges with a lack of confidence, or a lack of confidence with the technology that can be a significant barrier to either team members or team leaders getting involved with TED. And I quite often find that sometimes this might be a reason why a team leader won't step in to do TED for the first time, because they're concerned that they have to be really good at technology, or you need to be great at producing a PowerPoint to show your results or something like that. So that might be a real barrier to them taking that first step. So I think in terms of our support, it's really important to understand the challenges that are unique to every team, because every team is very different and will have different challenges and strengths that we can draw on when they're engaging with the TED. So before I go into some of the ways I've sort of worked with teams, I just wanted to throw this question out there. So what challenges do you see for low tech teams? Has anyone in here worked with a team that might have a technological barrier? Or I guess the question might be, are there any specific parts of the TED cycle that might be challenging for teams who do have technological barriers? Any thoughts on that? Tracy, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. I can't say that I've tried using the TED tool with these teams, but we've had I heard a question about it recently, which was a question around how does this work? How can we implement this TED tool, which I really support and love, in community teams? So I don't know if anyone else on the call has got community services in their trust or their organisations, but we are a mixed integrated trust of acute and community care. And it's not, I wouldn't say that the issue is necessarily low tech, but I definitely would say it's the barriers are associated with the tech, which is why I've jumped on the call, because it's more about, it's a very ambulatory type style of tech. It could be iPads, and then only getting back to the main machines at the end of the day. And as you say, they may not all be able to get into a private space with that. The iPads may not actually enable this to happen from the iPad, the TED tool. And also, I think it's something about that whole bit about being ambulatory and dispersed across the services. And Yeah, it's quite challenging. When we started to think about it, or when I started to think about the question, I thought, oh, yeah, that's quite interesting. It's a very different setup for a ward-based team than it is for a community services team. And our specialist team who deal with this are doing a fabulous job. And I'm sure I've got loads of solutions. But I happened to see this in my diary, and I thought, I'll jump on that because it is a recent question I've heard. So I just thought if anyone could share any ideas, that might be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, fab. Thanks, Tracy. And I think you're right to highlight that there are a lot of teams who might be based out in the community, or even teams that are spread across multiple different sites that might find it really difficult to use technology, to use it in a way, we might say, oh, it would be easy if everyone could jump on a Teams meeting, but sometimes that can be quite a barrier if everyone's just on an iPad or isn't in a place where they can just get on that meeting at the same time. So Justine, I'm not sure if you got your hand up there. Is it to add to that, or is it another thing?
Absolutely. Yeah, Tracy, we are a community health provider here at Sirona Care and Health. So all of our staff are out and about all day. So understand where you're coming from. We operate out of 120 sites. It's very rare for our teams to get together physically. So I understand where you're coming from in that people are not together, they're not in front of a computer. Most of our staff are in their car or in somebody's house or running a clinic in a church hall or something like that. So very dispersed and often working completely on their own. So the challenge is, first of all, for the team leader to introduce TED to their team. And often they do that by email, which isn't always the best way because sometimes people want to have that introduced to them in person and with a discussion and with an opportunity to ask questions. So we put in quite a lot of support for managers, even like drafting template emails and things and producing, kind of nice visual engaging kinds of communications for them to introduce TED in the first place. And then also to be really clear about that they should expect to receive an invitation to complete a survey. And again, thinking about why they should do it and then who's going to see the results and how they're going to discuss it as a team. And they do usually get together to discuss it as a team. And sometimes that's quite motivating for people because it is a rare opportunity for them to come together. So we've tried to encourage managers to say how nice it will be to spend half a day together or whatever and looking at their results and then working together on something because it is a rarity. So actually you can turn that into a bit of a strength by saying, TED gives you the real opportunity to come together and work on something because they rarely do. But it is difficult sometimes to get people to engage, but I think it is all about that first communication and getting people to complete the survey. And then if they have completed it, then they're usually quite keen to actually discuss the results and start working on activities together. It's that initial thing. But something that I learned quite early on was I said to managers who are themselves really used to working in this virtual environment with their team members and actually very rarely seeing their team members, saying to them, how do you think is the best way to engage with your team in your particular circumstances? The geographical spread and the virtual nature of their work and the fact that it is actually quite difficult to build up those kind of incidental conversations and things. And they were the ones who have said, well, actually, I've got some really well-established systems for getting information out to my teams. And so then we said, okay, well, how can we provide materials to support you to use your existing channels that you know are working well? So
that's great tip.
Always ask them about how are they doing the things that work and then build on that for them. It's the things like, they don't have time to draft emails or they don't have time to create, PowerPoint presentations and things like that. So they're the things that we can do as a template for them just to customize.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. That's really helpful.
Yeah, thanks. I really like definitely that emphasis on framing it the right way in the first place. I think that is so important. So yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks, Justine. And then, like you say, I think often the team and the team leader themselves are best placed to think about how can we flex this to the way we work. And I think there's a big part to be said for empowering them to do it in the way that feels right for them, and
Yeah.
not sort of imposing a structure on them, saying, okay, here's a general structure, let's talk about how this might work for you. But yeah, brilliant. Thanks for sharing, Justine. Chloe, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to add, we're a community mental health trust, and we are very dispersed throughout the county. But one thing that some of our managers have chosen to do is, because they kind of anticipated their team would have very little chance or access to technology to be able to complete the TED survey ahead of the sort of time together. They used the time together, again, like Justine said, sort of selling it as this is a real opportunity for us to kind of connect with one another. But they used that as protected time and made sure they had the technology available at that session, to allow people the time in the session to fill out the TED survey. So almost the first TED session is giving people that space to complete it, rather than sort of hoping that they will have done it ahead of time, and then sort of working in stages from there. And they found that that has worked really, really well for people, because they anticipated that the response rate would just be extremely low, however much they tried to promote and sell TED, just because of the sort of lack of regular access to technology. So that's something that some of our managers have been doing.
That's a really great tip too, to actually kind of provide the IT at the time. That's really helpful. That's a bit about what Lee was saying about empowering them to do it in a way that works for them, isn't it? That's really helpful. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, great suggestion. Thanks, Chloe. And I think that's a great example of how that team has found a way that they do have, there's a pocket of time where we know we can get everyone together. Let's think how we maximize that. How can we get the technology to the team at that time? Book a suitable room or whatever it might be, provide iPads or whatever you need in that situation, and flex it to what feels right for that team. So yeah, great example. Thank you. Marvelous. Fab. So yeah, some of the things that sprung to my mind when we're thinking of barriers that might put a team leader off or might be challenging for a team when they get involved in TED. I guess right at the start of the TED cycle, when a team leader's setting up the survey, something that I guess might be one of those confidence barriers more than a technological barrier, is that even if a team leader's set up on the site, they've got the computer, they might just need that bit of hand-holding through navigating the website. And this might include setting up the survey in the first place, sending out reminders for the survey. We're bringing in multi-factor authentication soon, so that again, that adds that extra layer of barrier, which might be difficult for someone who is just struggling with that confidence around a new piece of technology. So absolutely, this is somewhere where we might look to support. Another place where that crops up, and I think we touched on that there, is actually filling out the survey. Sometimes, I think quite often, managers will have access to technology to set up the survey, but for teams, like I mentioned earlier, who might not use computers as part of their role, actually getting into their emails might be a challenge. Having the time to complete can be a barrier for a lot of teams. The confidence in completing it and submitting it sometimes. And sometimes it might be things like language barriers as well. So by default, TED is in English. How can we get around that if there are team members who maybe English isn't their first language, and it might be more difficult for them to interpret the answers and give their answers as with confidence. So there can be barriers like that as well. Other things back on the team leader side now, it might be a challenge actually downloading the results, thinking, how do I do this? What's the best way to share them? If I can't print them, what are alternatives to doing that? And also, one I do see quite a lot, especially with team leaders who are new to TED, and I think this can be with anyone who's new to TED, as much as with the toolkits from an OD practitioner's perspective, it's a real feature of TED that we've got such a breadth of information and so many different toolkits to deal with different situations. That can actually be a barrier to someone who's brand new to it and might feel quite overwhelmed by the sheer volume of different things. And sometimes choice can be a bad thing because it makes it more tricky to understand what's the right thing to use when I've got this wealth of different choices. So again, this is somewhere where we might be providing support or advice to team leaders. And final one I've got on here is sharing the results. So I think you picked up on it on a couple of your examples there, that sometimes the challenge might be, where is the right space to do this? Have we got the right space? If we haven't, what are alternatives to doing that? It's one of the reasons why where I've set up that PowerPoint template for sharing your feedback, I'm always very cautious in terms of how I put that forward, because I don't want team leaders to feel they have to share the results in a PowerPoint format. You know, some teams will prefer to print off the survey and use it that way. Other teams might bring it up on a big screen or projector, but sometimes they don't have access to that sort of technology. So it's thinking, where's the right way and what's the right way for our team and what can work for us. So in terms of how we can help, when I think about the TED ethos, the intention with TED has always been to encourage and empower whilst being supportive. So wherever possible, we don't want to overset that support. And sometimes it can be quite easy to, when we see a technological barrier, to say, oh, we'll just do this for you. We don't want to totally step in and do it for teams, because there's the danger then that it creates that reliance on our support, and that each time they go through the survey cycle that they'll need someone from OD or HR or whoever's supporting to come in and help them with it. We do, however, want to ensure that teams and team leaders feel confident in their approach, and especially the first time they go through that TED cycle, it can be appropriate to a team who's having to think around some technological challenges for us to step in and help them think around how they can navigate around some of those challenges that they might have. So in terms of encouraging our teams, I think the first layer of this support, and really linking back to what Justine was said around that initial framing, I think is a big part of this. And thinking around, how do we encourage our teams and team leaders to use TED even before they've started on the TED journey. And this is an opportunity where we can encourage confidence by emphasizing that technology is really just a small part of the TED process. Really, the technology is there to help embed a continuous improvement process, and really the power of TED is in that continuous improvement. It's in creating that culture of learning, of reflective practice and collaboration in a team as well. Sometimes I've used that phrase. You've probably heard that quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast, but I've sometimes said culture eats technology for breakfast, because really your team culture is going to override those technological things, and that can do that in a negative way, because you can be the best team in the world at technology and get all the technology right, but if the team culture isn't working and you're not working on the culture in the right way, then it won't really matter. But equally, you don't necessarily need to be great at technology to use the approach and get that culture right. So it's really important to, I think, particularly when a team feels technology is a barrier, to downplay the importance of technology and just highlight how the technology is there to make sure that it's a safe way to provide feedback, but the real value in the TED process comes from the team discussion. It comes from working together as a team, and it comes from the leader setting that direction. I put this graph on screen. It's in no way science backed. It's just my view of in terms of what the different sort of proportions are of getting TED right. And technology is important because it is a web-based platform and it is something that is there to create that structure. but it is only a small part of getting it right. And really, the teams that are most successful with TED are ones that get that team conversation right. They get that communication right around communicating what TED is telling us, sharing ideas, listening to ideas as well. And then teams that also work together on their action plan towards whatever solution they come up with. And leadership is a part of that. But it's important to remember that it's not all about the leader. The leader is really just one part of the team, and they're there to just help sort of channel that energy that the team creates through TED. So as I say, the real value in this, the key focus of TED is to embed those team conversations, and TED really just provides that structure so that teams can have these regular conversations. I often think that the sort of peak of where a team could get to, and the sort of the aspirational sort of view for a team would be a team that perhaps gets to a stage where they don't even need TED, because they've got these conversations as part of what they do. They know the core principles behind TED, so they're regularly talking about the key things that make them work well as a team, and they've created this psychologically safe culture where people can provide feedback together. Now, we know that that is sort of very aspirational, and a lot of teams are a long way from that. So TED is a great way to give them that structure and to set them on that road towards that sort of aspirational future. But I think what that does sort of highlight is that really TED is just something to help provide that structure, and it's there to help generate that momentum. And really, it's the work the team does together that adds the most value to the process. Next one, I've used this someone on previous Lunch and Learns, this quote that perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think this is one that I often find myself trying to emphasize to new team leaders, that you don't need to be 100% perfect the first time you do a TED. And if anything, it's useful to have some things that maybe don't work quite as well as you would like them to, because that then gives you as a team leader and the team something to reflect on, something to think around. How might we try this a bit differently next time? And I think particularly with teams who might have a technological barrier, sometimes that might prevent them from taking the first step and having a go. And quite often I find that if teams do have a go and take that first step to do it the first time, that they will start to get ideas as they go through that first TED cycle around how they might do things a little bit differently next time. So if they try a virtual feedback session and it doesn't quite work, just reassure them that that's okay. Learn from that, talk with the team, understand why it perhaps didn't work, and then highlight the value of why next time you might want to all come together in the same place, and why that protected time for that is really important and really valuable for you as a team. So there's nothing wrong with not getting it perfect the first time. In fact, I would say I wouldn't expect any team to get it perfect the first time. It's about learning together, and that first time really is just to get that baseline that you can then build from as a team, and really gain that experience of what it feels like to go through TED. And then when you come to do it again, second, third, fourth time, you'll be that little bit better because you've got that experience in the bag. You've had a go at it. You understand what worked really well and maybe what didn't work really well, and you're ready to flex it again. Next step, so second layer of support that we can do then comes from empowerment. So I guess I touched on that a little bit in the last slide, but what we really want to do is empower teams and team leaders that they can make a change with this. I think often, sometimes before a team does a TED for the first time, teams and team leaders can sometimes feel like they are victims of their team culture and sometimes powerless to influence it. I've definitely seen this sometimes with teams who might have got challenging staff survey results, or there might be things in staff survey which when you talk to them, they just feel that we can't change that, that's out of our control, and you know, it's not something that we can take hold of and make a difference of. So by empowering the teams and the team leaders, from our perspective, it's around really helping them understand that they can make changes, and with something like TED they can start to make a difference. One of the main ways that we can do that is through coaching support. So in a coaching support session with a team leader, we might be trying to build their confidence. You might want to highlight the skills that they do have. So even though maybe technology is something that they feel is a weakness for them, there'll be other things, other parts that lend itself to the TED cycle which they might be really good at. So you'd be emphasizing things like their communication skills, if they're a great listener, if they're great advocates for their team and what they do. You might want to pick up on things they've done in the past with the team and think around how they adapt that into the TED process, and how they sort of build on things they've already done together, or how they learn on things that haven't worked in the past as well. Something you might also do through coaching is signpost to recommended toolkits. So I mentioned earlier that sometimes that sheer volume of toolkits can be quite daunting, especially for new team leaders. So with a coaching support or that initial interaction with a team, what you might do is take away all that choice and indecision. You might just say, oh, have a go at this team purpose exercise first. If you're unsure, do this one and use that to then think around what's next for us, or what feels right. Or once you've had that initial chat with a team leader, think around, what toolkit do I think that I can recommend for them, and then it saves them having to sort of navigate those different toolkits themselves. Next thing we can do to empower is share examples of others. And I think this is perhaps one of the most powerful things that we can do. If we can share maybe things like case studies, but I think most powerful is when teams can see other like-minded teams who are using TED, who've given it a go. So if you do have some of those, call them low-tech teams, if you have had some of those who've gone through TED, they can be great ones to be sort of advocates or sort of role models for other teams who might see that as a barrier. I think often if you can introduce them to another team leader who had similar concerns but went through with it anyway, then that can help to build that confidence. It takes me back, I don't think we've anyone on the call today from Doncaster, but something I did a couple of years ago for Doncaster is they asked me to do, they run like a leadership masterclass. I think it's monthly, where all the team leaders are invited onto a bit of a webinar. So they did one specifically on TED, and I talked a bit around TED and what we'd done at Lancs Teaching. But what I saw from that session is the most valuable part of that session for a lot of the team leaders was that some of the teams that had already done TED were on the call, and they talked around their first-hand experience and what it felt like to do it the first time, and how they were already seeing improvements. And that created a lot of energy in that session, and a lot of enthusiasm for other teams to use TED. So those examples are really valuable. And then also in terms of empowering, and I guess this comes along the line of reassuring them that technology is only a small part of the process, is to talk to them about ideas around how you can flex the approach to suit their specific needs. So some of you mentioned some things there, you might find specific rooms where they can use the technology. Something we've done with some teams is we've helped them access, here we go, we've helped them access the TED emails on their mobile device. So, if it is possible to set up the trust emails on a mobile, you can do that. Obviously, you need the permission of team members to do this. It is also possible to send a TED link to a personal email address. Again, encourage your team leaders to get that permission from team members. But if they feel that's an easier way to engage with their team and they've got the permission of team members, then that's absolutely an option that you could explore. And again, I think this comes down to framing it right in the first place, so that team members understand why you're doing it, how you're doing it, that their data is secure in the way that we use TED, and that it is anonymous as well. So it won't highlight them as an individual. Their feedback will just feed into that overall picture of the team. Other things that teams might want to do is maybe try and adapt existing opportunities. So if teams are struggling to create the time for maybe a feedback session or even to introduce TED to the team, think around how you can tag it into some of your existing communications that are working. So I think, Justine, you mentioned about some of your teams just use email a lot. And I think, although I wouldn't advise it for everybody, it is best practice to do it in person if you can. For those teams who just can't get that time together, what ways do they communicate currently that works for them? And what ways can we use to highlight those the TED process, and even to feedback the TED results as well. So I've seen teams adapt the TED feedback results to span over multiple sessions, maybe where they talk about one topic per session, one theme within TED, and that can work for teams. Other one, and we touched on this a little bit, you might want to provide a dedicated TED PC. So I've seen teams do this where they've got one set computer for the department and they've said, right, everyone will get 10 minutes, we'll book some slots where everyone can use this PC, or we'll have a designated person who perhaps is a bit more familiar with technology, who can support other members of the team to be there to help set them up, access the TED survey, and then fill in the results together. So that can be useful, and you might have dedicated time slots as well for different people. Something I've seen some teams do as well is, think about allocating maybe the first hour of a particular day to do a TED, or the last hour before team members clock off. Get some protected time for your team to fill in the TED survey, and that can work really well. And I suppose one along those lines is I've seen some teams use it as part of an away day. So they've not done it during the normal work process, but maybe once a year they have a specific away day and they've built their TED feedback into that session, or they've even built in fill in the survey into that session. And the advantages of that, while you've sort of got a captive audience, is you can get people to fill it in there and then, and you can get the results in real time as well. That again is somewhere where team leaders might need that bit of support, because it can be quite daunting to do that live, but it definitely can work and has worked for some teams. So third layer of support in here involves where we do get more hands-on. So quite often, as I said before, if a team has a technological challenge, the first time they go through TED, it can be one of those instances where it is appropriate to get more hands-on. And whilst the TED ethos, I guess, tells us to do this sparingly, those technological barriers are something which we can help teams through. So when you're doing this, the important thing is to remember to keep the team leader involved with the whole process, with the hope that they can learn from what you're doing. They can maybe shadow what you're doing so that they feel more equipped to be able to do it the second and any subsequent times they go through the TED cycle. The other key thing here is to make sure you've got really good initial contracting with the team. So we don't want to overstep the mark, and we want to make sure that anywhere we do offer support, that we're really clear on where that support starts and ends, and we don't sort of get dragged into doing everything for a team. So as part of that, it's really important to understand a team-specific challenge, because as I said on one of those earlier slides, every team's different and they'll have different working practices. They'll have a different existing culture in terms of the way they communicate, the way they work together, and the way they use technology. So next slide. So appropriate ways that we can step in to offer support might include setting up the survey with the team leader. And I know some trusts might do this as part of your team leader training session. So there are definite advantages to that. If you're running an in-person session and team leaders have their laptops or there are computers available, then there can be an advantage to setting it up there and then while you're in the room able to support, and while other team leaders are there, so that they can see how others are doing it. They can maybe buddy up and create that community around it. Other ways I've helped in the past is to go along to talk to a team before they do a TED to answer any questions or concerns they might have. Quite often questions you get in those sorts of sessions might be concerns around the anonymity of it. But for a team which might struggle with the technology, the questions might be around how can we access this? What's the best way to do it? Or often I do get the question, can we do this paper-based? And unfortunately, the answer to that is no, because the technology is the way that we protect that psychological safety. So it is an opportunity to emphasize that anonymous part of TED and really get that appreciation for why technology is a part of this, but also, as I was saying before, emphasizing that it's only a small part of it. The real value in TED will be what you do with your results, how you work together, how you come up with that shared action plan and take shared accountability for it. Next one I've got on there is on occasions you might want to go along with a tablet or computer. We definitely use this with our staff survey to help teams who perhaps don't have computers in their area. We might go along with a tablet and get people to fill it in when they get a bit of time. So this can work for some teams, or having that PC support, as I mentioned on that earlier slide as well. And sometimes it might just be a case of teams don't have access to be able to print or share the results, so you might print off some reports for them if you get that request from a team leader. And again, it's a relatively sort of low maintenance thing from our side to be able to support them with, but it's somewhere we can definitely help to overcome a challenge. Okay, so just a couple of tips. I recognise we're coming to the end of our time, but I have mentioned this one before, but I mentioned earlier around sometimes it might be a language barrier with the using the website and being able to use that. So in terms of tools that can help you, Google Translate is a really good one. I think on the next slide, our TED YouTube library, we're trying to build up all the time with useful how-to guides for team leaders to help support them through those bits using the technology especially. I'm just going to share my screen briefly at this point to show you how Google Translate works. If you've not used it before, can just check, can you all see that okay? Yep, fab. So just in terms of Google Translate, I think if I just come back to the home page, so it's translate.google.co.uk, but you can just Google it and it'll come up. But you get these different options on Google Translate. So if you go to translate a website, and if you just bear with me, I'll just copy a link from a TED survey that I've had. And what you can do if someone receives a TED survey into their inbox, but they prefer to read it in another language, what you can do on here, let's paste that in, paste in their unique link. So this will go through to their unique link as an individual. You need to then select the language. So on here, we're translating it to, I don't know, let's say Danish in there. And when we click through there, it will translate the TED survey into whatever language you want to. So that person can then fill it in and sort of read it and be comfortable that they're happy with the answers that they're giving. So that is a really useful tool that I've seen used with quite a few of our teams. But other things you can actually do, you can also translate images and documents. Sometimes with the results for a TED, I find it quite useful to translate. If I save the TED results as an image, let's see if I've got one here. Hopefully that's the right file. Oh, it's not going to translate that because I've still got it English there. Let's translate that to Spanish. So it will translate an image of your TED results and put it in the language that that person can pick up. Similarly, you can also do it with documents. Now, if I just scroll along, I've done one here. So this is the Circle of Influence in Italian. And you can see how it will convert a TED toolkit to a different language as well. So really useful tool there that can help if you've got that language barrier. I think, I'm not entirely sure, but you can also use that with Staff Survey if you want to as well. And then just another plug, I know going on about this a lot recently, but our TED engagement website, we're trying to put new videos on there all the time. So in here, for yourselves, you can see our past collaborative events, quarterly deep dives, lunch and learns, but also if you go into playlists, we've got some how-to videos in there and TEDcast videos for team leaders that might help support them with some of the areas where maybe there's that bit of a lack of confidence, or they need just that extra bit of help or guidance around something like setting up your survey, interpreting your results, or in TEDcast, if I go into that one, we've got things like dealing with challenging feedback, planning ahead. Topics like that can be really useful for team leaders. Okay, let's come back to my slides. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so to summarize, really, when we're thinking about TED with low tech teams, I hope this really highlights how really technology is just that small part of it. And if there is a challenge around technology, it doesn't mean that a team can't engage with TED. It's really often just around thinking how we can flex that process, how can we make it fit for this team. And I think as we were saying with Tracy's example earlier, often the team might be the best placed to think around how do we make this work for us. So sometimes I think that initial contracting process and understanding the specifics of each team can be the most important part of getting this right, so that you can help them flex and then you can empower them to be able to use the TED approach in the way that suits them. The aim, as always with any team really, is to build that confidence and to help them feel that they can get involved with it and that they can be on that continuous improvement journey. And where possible, we can minimize those technological barriers and build that confidence over time. Okay, so that is everything for today. Happy to answer any questions if you've got them, but just to signpost you to our upcoming events that we've got on. So our coffee catch-ups, you might have noticed earlier on this week, if you've been in, we've moved the one from September from Tuesday to Monday. That's just because of scheduling. I've gone and booked myself a holiday, so that will be on Monday the 9th of September, and I'll be there between 11 and 12. Love to see you there if you're available. And our next one after that, we'll run these every month, is in October. In terms of lunch and learns, this is actually our last lunch and learn of the year, because we always have a break in October and November to allow people to focus on staff survey. But we do still have 2 quarterly deep dives. So one in September, so that's next month's event on the 24th between 11 and 1. And one in December on the 5th of December. For September's event, our main focus, there'll be a little bit around using TED alongside staff survey. I know it's something we do talk about quite a lot, but we're coming up to that time of year, so it feels appropriate. But we'll also be showcasing some of the work that East Kent are doing around talent management and how that might fit in with TED. And what we're also hoping to do is showcase our new database reporting features that will be on the update, and an update on our MFA rollout. Again, just a bit of an announcement. Initially, we had planned to set MFA as mandatory from the beginning of September. We have shuffled that back to the beginning of October just to allow more users to set it up if they want, and also because we know October, November are generally quieter times in terms of teams doing TED, because quite rightly our focus is on staff survey. But that's all from me. If you've any questions, happy to answer them, but otherwise enjoy the rest of your day and have a lovely weekend. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Lee.